Hey, and welcome back, everybody, to the final episode of the DEFCON 5 series. A look at defenders and controllers on the City of Heroes, the homecoming servers, on the epic quest in order to find the MVP of the supporting world. That's what we're talking about. We've been looking at these two archetypes for several months. Holy bejeekers, a long time. We've been looking at 5 different controllers and 5 different defenders, comparing them in head-to-head pairings, looking for different stats, compiling a bunch of numbers, recording a bunch of videos, doing a bunch of analyses for 50 total missions, as you can see here for the defenders, and 51 missions for the controllers. Close to 13 hours of playtime with numerous teammates, numerous enemies, numerous maps, too many to count. And we've been looking at them with a statistical lens because we're not just going to sit here and preach to you what we think is the better archetype, that controllers with their synergy between controls and support sets are better than defenders. Or wait, no, it's defenders are better than controllers because they've got superior modifiers on their buffs and debuffs, and then they got a whole bunch of blasts they can unleash and have this big old argument and look on paper. No, we've been doing this live for you, throwing it out there to the masses to make their own decisions. And we're looking at it with statistics, numbers. I've been looking at the sums, adding a bunch of stuff up. How many total this and total that did these characters do on their missions? I was looking at the means, the averages, the take all the different numbers divided by whatever number of missions, you name it. Been doing that. We're then taking these numbers and comparing them using statistical averages, standard errors, looking at error overbar or overlapping error bars, composite data. We've been taking rates and dividing it by teammates in order to standardize for both time and the number of teammates. And looking at distribution plots to see if there's any outliers or skewed data that might throw off these averages. We've been looking at these rates, the amount of whatever statistic, outputs, inputs, teammates, kills, defeats, you name it, per minute. We've been looking at correlations between those. As time increases, does the value or the number of this stat go up or down? We've been looking at contributions, percentages, ratios, you name it. It's like your worst nightmare of math class from high school, all rolled into one. And in today's episode, part 2 of the Final Judgment in DEFCON 5, we're not going to disappoint. We're going math heavy, heavy, heavy today. And we're going to start off by looking at the survivability stats. So in our last episode, part 1, I went through the process of comparing, recapping for you, all of the different pairings of defenders and controllers. And so what you're seeing here on your screen is we have our defender collection over here on the right or the left side in blue. And then we have our controller side over here on the right in the red, I guess, pink. And what you're seeing here are the 5 pairings, the 2 electrical defender controller, electrical affinity, the 2 nature affinity, the 2 time, the 2 kinetics, and the 2 traps. And heretofore, you have mainly seen these as individuals. And I have spoiled a little bit along the way in the later DEFCONs, taking a look at the across the board numbers for defenders and controllers. But this is the first time ever that you are going to see the across the board for the defenders versus the across the board for the controllers. We have all of those beautiful, gorgeous numbers sitting here on one massive table for you to digest at your leisure. So get yourself a little bottle of wine or glass of water or whatever it is you take with your meals and sit back and relax because we're going to get into this. Now, For the most part, these data tables, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on other than to kind of set up what I'm going to go into in the later pages here. But we will spend at least a moment because we've already seen most of this anyway. I've shown you these tables in each and every DEFCON. But again, this is the total data. And the big thing I kind of want to just point out here is just the conglomerate, the bulk of this data here, because as we were doing this individually, right, we were only seeing one stack of data versus one other stack of data, and it's kind of easy to sort of pigeonhole or cherry pick certain data as you look at this, or poo-poo certain data because oh you're only looking at these 5 missions and those 5 missions, or you're looking at this one character versus that one character. How can you possibly draw any conclusions that way? And I've said from the beginning, you can't. We can only look for trends and correlations and, patterns. But then my argument has been is once I have the conglomerate data, the whole mess of it, then we're going to ask the question, is there anything here hiding amongst all these numbers? And so what these numbers here are showing you, this is the survivability stat. This is the number of defeats that the characters suffered uh, on the missions, all 13 hours, all 51 missions. And I think what you will see is dang, I was living. I was living large, living in charge. I only had 7 defeats on the defender side, 4 defeats on the controller side, a total of 11. When you compare that to the number of defeats my allies suffered, I think you're gonna see that these characters did pretty dang good. They were pretty survivable given the scenarios. But we're not just gonna look at those just 1v1 kind of numbers, just these individual totals, but just kind of setting this up for us. The numbers we're really gonna focus on are gonna be numbers like these rates that you're seeing down here. These are the rates. Those are the per minute numbers. And we're also going to be looking at the other column next to it. That's the composite. That is the rate per teammate. And the reason for the rate is kind of obvious. How many defeats per minute? So we've got a total number of minutes. We've got a total number of defeats. And you can just divide those two and get an answer. But what these numbers are actually showing you is the average of all the rates on all of the individual. So we're not taking the sum down here and doing the division. We're taking the individual mission rates that you see, all these numbers here, and then averaging those. And then we're going to be comparing those numbers versus the controller numbers. So on average, these defenders had a survivability rate of 0.020 per minute. Multiply that by 60, you'll get the per hour ratio. So these guys were dying like 1.2 times an hour, and these guys were about 0.54 times an hour. So right off the bat, it seems, hey, the controllers are more survivable. But remember, what we've been doing all along is, what does that number actually mean? What does 0.02 mean versus 0.009? Is that significantly different or not? Can we say, yo, these controllers are way more survivable than the defenders? Or is that just a statistical, random, possible option? They could just as well have been worse. We don't know. We don't have enough total data to look at. It's inconclusive. And then the composite data is taking those rates and dividing it by the teammate number, because what ultimately happened is that in some cases my teammate numbers fluctuated. It wasn't all the time, but it was a few times that led to not the standard 4 teammates that I had desired when I first designed this study. And that's because things are just random. People are going to quit the team, drop the team, leave the team early, have to go make dinner, make lunch, whatever it is. Or you end up feeling sorry because you accidentally invited too many people and didn't want to kick anybody. So, all right, fine, we'll go with an extra body. There's lots of variation like that. And that kind of brings me to another point before I dive into the actual data, because this came up in a recent comment on the last YouTube video here on part 1. Is one of you guys out there had suggested, hey, well, this would be really great data if everything was lockstep exact missions, the same team the whole way. And while I agree with that on paper, the problem is reality, as you can see here. There's no way in Hades I could ever get the same four people to play 10 different character pairings, 5 missions, 50 missions, the same exact thing every single day, week, whatever time I was doing it. Let's say I could get something like that locked up. I got some real loyal followers out there, and a lot of you guys did help me out. A lot of you guys from the Best of the Worst crew joined in. I appreciate all the help there. But there's always gonna be somebody who's gonna miss, or somebody's gonna drop, or somebody's computer's gonna crash, or whatever else. So had I locked myself into a setup of an experimental design like that, any little glitch would have blown up the entire thing. So imagine that had you gotten all the way to the end, and all of a sudden in that final mission or so, somebody's computer blows up and they can't finish. You start over. I mean, what happens? By having a variable such as that and accepting the variation, accepting the chaos, embrace the chaos, you can rely upon mass of numbers instead, looking for patterns. So I understand and I fully acknowledge that this is not a perfectly designed experiment as far as the traditional means, but the methodology I have proposed here, the shotgun chaos approach, and getting a massive bulk of data and looking for patterns and trends in the averages, these rates, that is a valid scientific study. Okay, I forget the exact name of it. I posted about it and defended this up on the forums. But anyway, just throwing it out there before anybody else is like, oh, this is gibberish. Maybe it's your first time. Welcome. But there is method to the madness here. So, what I'm outlining for you all here is massive bulks of data that we're looking at, like this table here. We're going to be zooming in on numbers like rates and composites, and we're going to be asking those questions. If we see differences, do they mean anything? If we see distributions that are wide or narrow, does that mean anything? If we see when one variable goes up and the other one goes up, is there a correlation between those variables? Or is everything just random and there is no pattern? That's what we're going to try to find out. So here with survivability, let's get to it. Survivability, here you go. Those two numbers I just told you, 0.020 and 0.09, if we take that grand total of the average defeat rates of the defender versus the controller, and we plot the standard error as error bars, you can see that there is overlap between the error bars. Now, hey, what do the error bars tell you? What the error bars are telling you is this. The bar graph is plotting the average. So the peak, the top of the bar graph, is the average rate of defeat. That's the 0.02. What the error bar is doing is it's telling you it's 0.020 plus or minus X number. That X number is the standard error value. Statistical calculation. I'm not going to bore you with it, but it's the float in the data. It's the random variability of the data. It's telling you that the true mean, the true average, could be up as high as this, or it could be as low as this. And so when we look at these two characters side by side, if those bars with their averages don't line up, but their standard error bars do line up, then we know that there is a chance right in here, this overlap area, that they are the same as each other. They're indistinguishable, might be a better way to say it. There is no statistical difference between the two. Therefore, if you look at the data between the defender and the controller, even though the controller died fewer times and had a lower defeat rate, there is no statistical difference between the two archetypes. They're as survivable as one another. That's what that data tells you. Now we can go ahead and Look a little bit closer. We've got the composite data. This is those rates over here divided by those variable number of teammates. So we're trying to standardize by teammate. And what we're looking here is at a distribution, a box and whisker plot. And so what we see here is when we look at the bulk of the data, which is represented by these rectangles, in this case you have just one that's visible to you at least this range of the data, but this represents the IQR, which stands for the interquartile range. That represents the bulk of your data, 50% of it. So when I did those 25 missions worth of data and the 26 missions worth of data, and you plot those dots, most of the data, most of the dots are going to be lumping together in the IQR, 50% of them. The other data points are going to be either above the IQR or below the IQR. They are the upper and lower quartiles, so 25% and 25%. And when we have that plotted out, and this is not the best graph to show this one, but you'll see it in some of the later ones. So you can see here's the IQR for the defenders. Here is the upper quartile range. The lower quartile range is buried because it's 0. You can't go below 0 survivability, right? You don't get extra lives. So if we look at the spread of the data is what this is showing us. If it's a tight spread, then the data is very consistent from mission to mission, character to character. Then what else you're going to see aside from the 50%, 25, 25% is you're going to see potentially additional dots. These are outliers. These are data points that don't fit the bulk of the data. For those of you who've gone to college or know anything about, bell curve testing, that sort of thing, or grading, this is really just a bell curve. If you plot data points of an average group of people, test scores, height, weight, whatever, the bulk of the data falls within this plus or minus, I forget, was it 1 standard deviation from the mean being here. But this range of a bell curve is that interquartile range. And then you've got other people who are falling 2 standard deviations above and 2 standard deviations below. They would represent those other quartiles. And then you got the people that blow the curve, the exceptionals, whether it's way up here or way down here. So even though on the test the average was a 62, somebody got a 98 in the class and somebody got a 13. Those are the outliers that you're seeing here. So bulk of the data should be here. The more narrow it is, the skinnier this rectangle is, the tighter the data is, the more consistent it is. And so what this is going to allow you to do is see, is there any weirdo data that is pulling these averages and skewing them so that these rates maybe appear bigger than they really should. So if I have some huge amount of outliers all, way up here, and this causes this bar graph to be really high, at first it may seem like, whoa, these two are really different. But if we go ahead and look at the distribution data and we say, whoa, 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 there's a ton of outliers here, that can help us explain some of this data over here. Plus, it just gives us a measure of how consistent the characters were mission to mission, team to team. Because if everything is equal, then the distribution should be very tight, right? If the maps are equal, the foes are equal, the team is equal, etc., then you're going to see pretty tight data. And that's the other thing that I can use to kind of counter anybody who would like to contest that, hey, you should have run the same exact thing every time. Well, sure, but if my data is shown pretty tight spread and not a bunch of just scatter shot of randomness, then I can more comfortably tell you that, yeah, even though I did run different teams, different missions, different factions, different characters, different builds, etc., my distribution is telling me that, hey, these are pretty even matchups. So as we look here, of the 25 defender and 26 controller runs, the controller's extremely tight data with 3 outlying data points. The defenders, pretty tight data. I mean, look at the range here. You're from 000 to 004 or something like that, with a little bit extra coming up here on the upper quartile. So all of that data is collecting within here, and we do have 4 outlying data points. So these could tell you perhaps, whoa, that was that one mission where one of my teammates, they went AFK and we got team wiped. Or maybe, oh, that was the mission where the dude ran into the bank before anybody else was there, triggered a bunch of ambushes, and a bunch of people died. So we can go back and look at, hey, what was the mission that produced that data point, and zoom in on it to decide whether or not, hey, is that a keeper or is that a tosser? Tosser. Anyway, that's what that data is showing us. As we look at the correlations, they're pretty dang, when we look at the composites, they're pretty darn tight. We don't have huge outliers. I mean, even though, hey, that's an outlier, but again, look at the teeny tiny numbers we're talking about. We're, 005 and this is like 03-ish. So it's not a huge number that's really skewing the data, but it can, help you understand, hey, maybe that's why the defender's a little bit higher than he should have been, because maybe there's a couple outliers here that are pulling this data up. Maybe this was a really bad mission right here, and that's explaining this rate that looks skewed. All right, then our third statistic that we have for each of these studies is our correlation data. And this is the one that is comparing the X and Y axes, and you're making a line of best fit. So we have our individual data points from each mission. So this mission right here would have lasted 20 whatever minutes. And on that mission, this character died 2 times. So we have the X value is time. We have the Y value is the number of defeats. And we plot those data points, the blue ones being the defender, the orange ones being the controller. And then we make a line of best fit that goes through the origin, because at time 0 there would be no deaths. So we make a line of best fit that summarizes the data. Our slope, if we were to calculate it, would give us our rate, how many defeats per minute, right? It's the change in Y over the change in X, rise over run, all that fun stuff. So our slope is giving us defeats per minute. But then what we do is we run a statistical analysis on here known as correlation, or R squared. And what this is telling us is it's giving us essentially a percentage that answers the question, hey, is that slope we just drew, is that line we just drew, is that rate we just figured out, is that representative of the actual data? Like, what are the odds it represents the data accurately? And so these numbers are telling you that it's like 28% and 19%. You want, at least for correlation, not necessarily you want correlation, but if there is correlation, you should see numbers close to 1. That would be 100%. In other words, X and Y are lockstep with each other. I'm using a cutoff of greater than or equal to 0.9, so 90%. So if I see a number that shows me 90 or higher, then I'm going to say, yeah, there's correlation. As time goes on, there is more personal defeats. So if you look at this data, I can't say that for either one of the defender or the controller archetype. As a matter of fact, it's almost zero correlation. So whether or not my character was defeated had nothing to do with how long the mission was. So that's telling you there's random things happening on the mission. Maybe some crazy thing happened, some big spike of damage came down. Or in the one example, when I was running my DEFCON with nature and my defender stepped out of the door of the arson mission, he got absolutely lit up by the PPD ambush that was coming. Didn't have a chance before the door even animated closed and I could touch my keyboard and do anything. My character was dead. So random things like that will fight against your correlation studies. So if we summarize our interpretation then of what this all means, because this is where we're going, right? We want to know who's better, if anybody. Here's what we know. Defenders, they did take more defeats on average, but the difference wasn't statistically significant. There was some slightly more volatile that range in their survivability. Controllers, they had fewer defeats overall, tighter clustering in their distribution, but there were a couple spikes here and there. You saw that from the outliers. The distribution insight, defenders had a few more outliers, or sorry, one more than the controllers, 4 versus 3. Maybe a little bit more variance there, but most of the data is still tightly clustered around the mean. There's no correlation between defeat rate and the time. Verdict for this one, neither archetype has a consistent edge. So performance, what you're doing on the mission, is greater than the archetype, has more impact on this statistic than whether you're a controller or defender. So archetype doesn't matter, it's independent. All right, that is our first statistic, first analysis. Let's move on to risk. So risk is your teammate defeats. How many times did your teammates defeat during the mission? So again, here's all the data for all of the characters. And remember from the defender numbers up here, it was 7 versus 4 as far as personal defeats go. So I kind of wanted to sort of compare this 7 versus 4 to give you a interesting metric. 7 times the defender died, and 4 times the controller died. So it seemed, hey, controller's a little safer. Then we look at this statistic. We had 38 total versus 40. So defenders, hey, they were a little bit better at defending and saving their teammates. Controllers were a little bit worse, especially if you kind of look at the ratios here, right? This is 10-1 odds. This is what, 9, 6, 6-1, something like that. Math not good right now. Yeah, I think it's like 5, 6-1, something like this. So maybe the defender's sticking their face in there and getting killed in order to save the teammate. That could be an argument. But again, is that true? Is that statistically proven by anything? I don't know if I've specifically tested that question, but the raw numbers is not what I can test anyway. What really matters are those rates, because those 38 defeats happened over 337 minutes, shorter time, versus the 40 defeats, a little bit more defeats for allies, but over a longer time. So if we look at the rates and we compare those, that's what's most important. And the rates are these, 0.09 versus 0.10. Those rates, as you can see, are almost identical. Well, you can see if I would move it up a little bit. So they're almost identical rates to one another. Scoot that up. So probably, I mean, I can guess before I even show you the graphs that there's not going to be any statistically significant difference between these two characters for ally protection, this risk rate. And then we have our composites, 0.02 versus 0.03. Those are the rates divided by the teammate number. The average teammate's 404, 377. So let's go ahead and take a look and see what do the statistics say, because on paper, if we're not statistics savvy, we might make that argument that defenders are better at defending their team and come up with a hypothesis about sticking their face in there and taking one for the team. But then when we look at the actual rates and do the statistic numbers, is this still a fact or not? And that's what this data is going to show us here. Here's our risk rate and our composite and our correlation. All right, so we look at the risk rate, 09, 0.1. You can see the error bars are completely overlapping, right? There's very little daylight between them. Our risk composite, this is that distribution of the data. You can see almost perfect overlap of the IQRs, the interquartile ranges, that bulk of the data, and the upper quartile is also pretty overlapping. There are a couple of outlying data points on the controller. So this is telling you there were a couple of missions where a whole bunch of allies died on the controller team that may explain why this is a smidge higher. And if maybe this mission didn't happen, maybe you decide to drop your outlier data missions, then this number now comes down. And maybe it's even better than the defender at that point. I don't know. But what I do know is the defender did not have any outlying data. So this is arguing for maybe a little bit more consistency. Maybe a little bit better protection? Question mark. You don't lose control like the controller did on a couple of missions. Maybe. Or maybe these are just flukes of fate. Who knows? Now let's go ahead and take a look at our correlation. Now we could guess or we could inform ourselves because I say, hey, who knows? I could go and look at these specific two missions and try to answer that question. Was there something weird that happened that can explain this? Or was it truly just a fluke? Something happened in the mission. You couldn't control it. It was some, crazy RNG number and boom, somebody died. Who knows? We'd have to go back and look at the videos, look at the data. And so that is possible. I'm just not going to do it in this video, that's for sure. And then risk correlation, here we go again. We're taking a look at the data points, plotting them on X and Y axes here, making a line of best fit, and then running correlation studies. And as we can see, there is no correlation between the amount of time, the length of time a mission ran, and the number of defeats my allies suffered. These are probably some of those, outlying data points, something like this one here. So again, no correlation. It doesn't seem to matter how long you're on the mission. Your risk is independent of that mission's time. So there's other factors at play that are determining whether or not a mission is dangerous. Now let's see if we can interpret some of this data for the Allied defeats. Interpretation. Overall outcome. No significant difference between the risk rate of defenders and controllers. Both the archetypes had an average team defeat of about 0.1. Their teams suffered a defeat roughly once every 10 minutes is what that translates into on average. Consistency, spread of the data. The composite distributions for both archetypes are narrow. They overlap, indicating stable and similar performance levels. The controllers showed two outliers, the above, those numbers that were high, indicating occasional team collapse. Now that might be a strong word. Did the team collapse because of something that the controller did, or is it something the person did and got themselves in trouble? I don't know. We'd have to go look at the data, the video itself. But it wasn't anything that the defender ran into. Exceptions, not patterns, though. Now, if I had a bunch of outliers, that could start leaning towards, yeah, there's a pattern. Those controllers are losing control. And that was one of the questions I was postulating or posing during some of the individual DEFCONs. From some of the distribution data, it seemed on average the defender distribution data was narrower than the controller data. And so I was kind of positing that because controllers are sort of all or nothing. Either you did control somebody and had really great mitigation, we'd have a low number here, or you didn't have control of something and had very little mitigation that could lead you to higher incoming damage and defeats. So because there's sort of this black and white control style play, that might explain that. This is kind of, I don't necessarily say arguing against it, but it's not really supporting that too much, aside from those couple of outliers. If I had more outliers, I think that could be more fitting in that hypothesis. I don't think I've refuted that hypothesis yet, but it's not strongly supported here. No correlation to time, so mission length was irrelevant. Long or short, rate was consistent, reliable across mission types and durations. Conclusion, despite controllers having occasional spike events, maybe the burst control could be, oh, the other thing that could be, forgot to mention, maybe the reason the controllers have a couple wonkier data points is they're relying heavily on pets. I'm going to get to this in a minute, but I talked about this in many of the DEFCONs. Control, or not necessarily control, but pet damage output was, to me, off the charts. The amount of damage pets were contributing was crazy. But they also may be a source of mitigation. And so maybe the pet's doing wonky, weird things for the controller, not defending or mitigating and instead running off and chasing something. Or if some of the videos where you saw, for instance, caltrops or burn patches and the pets get afraid and they start to scatter, that could explain some of these potential numbers because the pet's no longer doing any sort of defensive job. It's running away. So that's a possibility as well. But again, we don't have enough data there to support it. We'd have to run another 50 missions or something to start to get more information about that and maybe pay closer attention to the pets. Or the other thing I could do, I do have the data for it, but I didn't bother because I didn't think it was relevant at the time, is I could look at, I believe the logs, the chat logs, have the damage dealt to the pets. So I could potentially look at that, see how many times the pets were hit, how much damage they took, and maybe that can help correlate something. Don't know. I didn't bother looking at it, but it's something I could do. All right, now we're going to move on to a new analysis that I came up with as I was working on this data. Because now, once I have all this data, it gave me some other thoughts or ideas, like some of the ones I'm sharing with you now. And this one's known as defeat load. I think I did this or thought about this in the last DEFCON. But hey, what's defeat load? So, across all of the DEFCON series, right, all of these 51 missions, well, we got some questions. How punishing were these missions on the team? How well was the team protected over time? And which archetype carried the weight of the team's safety better? So what defeat load is going to do is if you add all the player defeats, so all the personal defeats of the controller or the defender, and divide those total defeats by the average number of teammates. So I had 404 or 377. So total defeats divided by number of teammates, or number of teammates, or there's the total. Yeah, sorry, this is the total. So add 504, and 477. So defeats divided by the number on the team, you get a defeat load. In other words, how many defeats per character on the team? How many total defeats per player? And so what we see here is we take the number that way because the defenders on average had slightly larger teams overall than the controllers did. And they had slightly fewer total defeats. But when we divide that out, we see that our defender had about 8.93 defeats per player, and the controller was 922. So these are our two numbers we're looking at. And so if we look at this, the defeat number per teammate, very close, of course. Both archetypes had about 9 each. And that backs up our previous conclusions. There was really no meaningful difference in team-wide fragility or risk management. The load per player was basically the same. So this is just trying to factor in, is there anything popping out like, whoa, on the per teammate deaths over here because it was a larger team or whatever, there was fewer, hey, this was 6 and this was 10, right? We don't see big, wide discrepancies like that. So we can kind of say that the missions were pretty equally threatening to both archetypes because they're both scoring about the same number of defeats per teammate. And now remember, this is factoring in all the random number of teammates and archetypes and builds and sets and everything else that everybody had, right? It's lumping that all together. And so you could say, hey, if one team had a whole bunch of incarnates on it, and that's why they had much lower numbers, blah, 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 that would show up in a little analysis like this. We don't see numbers like that jumping out at us, though. They're pretty close to each other. So the defeat load was pretty lockstep between the two archetypes sets of missions. All right, let's move on to our third category statistic, the lethality numbers. These are the numbers of foes that were defeated on the missions by the characters. So again, we've got all this data from all the different defenders and all the different controllers, adding it all up, dividing by time, etc. Now here's where we start to see some interesting differences, because right now the individual stuff, allied defeats, personal defeats, no big difference. But check this one out. 998 foes total were defeated by the defenders versus 1,384 by the controller. That is close to 400 more defeats by the controller. 400 more. Now, maybe that's because the controllers were running longer. And yes, on average, the controllers' missions were longer. We had 337 minutes versus 413 minutes. That's a pretty hefty difference. What is that, 70, 80 minutes? So that's about an 80-minute difference over here. 80 minutes. So when we do the math, we do the division, and remember what I'm doing is I'm taking the average of all these individual missions all these individual rates, and coming up with 3 foes defeated per minute for the defender versus 3.6 per minute for the controller. So at first, when we look at the whole numbers, we're going, holy moly, those controllers are whooping the defender's behinds. But when we actually parse the data out per minute, it's not a huge difference, 0.6 per minute. Is that statistically significant? That's our big question. The composites are similarly close. We've got 0.8 and we've got 1. So that is the number of defeats per minute per teammate. Pretty close. Let's take a look at the graphs and see what they show us. Statistically different or not. Here we are. Here's lethality. And I think you guys can see this. I might need to zoom in. 1 second while I zoom this in. All right, I zoomed in and I bolded the lines a little bit for you to see this. You can see it now. Here's your defenders, 3. Here's your controllers, 3.6. Is that statistically significantly different from one another? We're looking for overlap of the error bars. The defender is clocking in just around 3.2 at the upper limit. And check out our controller. Just over 3.2 at its lower limit. So, yes, there is a statistically significant difference. It's not huge. Statistically significant difference. It's not huge. It's not, oh my God, look at that. But it does exist. The controllers are more lethal than the defender. We can see it in the numbers. So, +1 on the controller side. They're killing more people. Okay, that's what that's showing you. Fact. Okay, zoom back out. How about the composite data? Is there something in the distribution that shows, whoa, there's a couple of crazy ass missions out there where the controllers lit it up, outliers, and that could explain it? There is one. There is one mission where there is an outlying data set. Now, is that enough to move that high enough to skew the data so that this is not really significantly different? I don't know. I don't know if there's a stat to do that. But the distributions, you can see the controller's a little bit wider, a little bit more scattered data, a little bit, more plus or minus, but there is some overlap. It's very similar to what you see with the averages here, right? If you just kind of blob in the averages, that's kind of what we're seeing here. The X, by the way, is the average. But we have a little bit more distribution up here. So the controller is able to hit some higher peaks. It is able to put out some higher body count per minute per teammate than the defender is. Now, was that a fluke, or is this just showing you they have greater potential and the defender has more potential to underperform? I don't know. Maybe that's what that means. But that's the kind of thing that you have to start looking at, starting to ask the question. All right, what else do we have here to take a look at? We have correlation data. Let's see if there's anything correlating here. We go ahead and plot again the number of defeats, and we have the time on the x-axis here. And we look at our correlations on those slopes. Controller 0.85. It's close to the 0.9 cutoff, but it's not close enough to say that definitively, as mission time increases, controllers are defeating more enemies. Now, it's pretty close, but that's not 100% true. We can say that for the defenders. They do have correlation. So the longer missions are going, the more bodies defenders are dropping. And there may be a story there. There may be a story. Let's see if we have a story to tell or not. Let's go ahead and take a look at the interpretation of this data. See if this makes any sense to anybody. Anybody but me, I don't know. So here we go. So controllers, here's what we can say. They had the higher average kill rate than defenders. It wasn't dominating though. It was more consistent. Controllers are perhaps opportunists because remember, what we're looking at here is this is the controllers defeats. This is not the rest of the team. This is just how many bodies the controllers dropped. So maybe they're opportunistic. They're landing the killing blow, right? The killing blow is what this is measuring. They might not have done any other damage except for the final one that took the enemy out. So maybe they're opportunists. They create fragile windows of vulnerability through their controls, through illusions, confusion, whatever, and then they're capitalizing on it. Damage output is going to be coming in waves, right? So start to think about all the damage sources that the controllers have. Phantasms, creepers, their various pets, a lot of the DOTs, containment, etc. And it's working for them because controllers, I mean, their job is to put the battlefield under their thumb, right? They're like the wizard of the superhero world. They're able to manipulate the battlefield to their advantage and then crush the enemies that are on it. But they're not like rushing around and blowing stuff up like blasters. They're setting things up and then letting the clockwork do their thing, letting their pets do what they need to do. Defenders, from what I can tell, they're more of a slow burn. As time is going up, they are becoming more deadly. Why? They're using debuffs. They got auras. They got positioning they need to worry about, cones to line up. And all that stuff takes time to set up. Maybe those first couple clicks, first few seconds of a battle are throwing a debuff, putting a patch out there, and then they can start the attack. Controllers, they can come in there, throw controls out there, which are going to lock things in place and probably do some damage. And then the pets are in there, and then they can kind of worry about maybe doing some buffing. So with defenders, while their average kill rate was lower, the correlation is telling this story that longer mission, defenders are becoming more dangerous. So they are not necessarily cranking out the damage right away, but they're gaining traction the longer a fight goes. And this might be one of the things that you see on higher level teams where defenders can be disappointed because if your archetype is more designed for that long haul attrition type of fighting, but missions are just freaking going fast because everybody's dropping ionic judgment bombs and everything, you don't get a chance to build traction. You're just constantly playing catch up. But if we just ask the basic question, who is deadlier, who's killing more? Well, the controllers. It's slight, but it's there. But who is shaping the tempo, getting the team cranking? That's harder to say, I think. I think your controllers are going to be more front loaded, right? You're going to come in there and drop some pets, throw some controls out there. That sets up your containment. Blammo, you finish it. Defenders, you're throwing out a buff on the team. You're debuffing the enemy. Maybe you got to throw a heal in there. And then you start lining up your blasts and start working the damage and taking advantage of those debuffs. And you're able to eventually get to your peak, but you're more of a sustained ramp up. So that's what I think is going on here as far as this lethality data is showing us. Now we're going to take a look at lethality load. So it's just like the defeat load, but lethality. And what this is going to show, so let me zoom out a little bit more here. 1 second. There we go. I think I fixed it. All right, so lethality load. So what this is going to ask is very similar. We're going to be trying to interpret this kill pressure. So what we've got is asking this question: how lethal were the teams overall? How much offensive pressure did they apply as a group? And which archetype, if any, generated more team impact over time? And so to answer that, we're trying to calculate something known as lethality load. And so what lethality load is we're going to add up all the foe defeats that were logged, and we're going to divide that by the average number of teammates. This time we're going to exclude the support character. So all the foe defeats excluding the support character. And we want to know how many kills were generated per teammate slot across all the missions. And that's going to give us a sense of team-wide combat output. and let us directly compare that to the lethality stats of the defender and the controller. Because we know how many defeats per minute that our defenders and controllers, or how many defeats per teammate our defenders and controllers were doing. But what about the teammates? So here's what we've got. Take a look at our lethality load here. So defenders versus controllers. We'll take a look at this upper right graph first. And I might need to zoom in on that for you. Give me 1 second. All right, here we go. So we've got the first pair of columns is teammate kills. And so on the defender side, the teammates had a total of 3,439 foe defeats. So 3,439. The controller's teammates had 3,057. So the defender's teammates were defeating more foes. If we divide that by the number of teammates, because remember that was variable in some of these missions, we're getting 851 per teammate for our defender versus 811. Now what's interesting about this is that if we compare this teammate number to, this is then the support character numbers that we have already, the 998 and the 1384 numbers. And so we originally saw that, hey, look, the controllers, they're killing more, right? And we divided that by the time to get the rate, and they were still killing more, and it was statistically significant. But then when we look at the teammate numbers, this is interesting. The teammates of the defender were out killing the teammates of the controller, even though the numbers were pretty close overall. There is a slight edge. Now, again, is that statistically significant or not? I don't know. I didn't run a specific test in that. But it's interesting because maybe the defender's damage is appearing over here. The defender's threat is appearing over here because they're buffing the teammates. They're debuffing the enemies more strongly than the controller. So even though the controller is showing more kills per minute and whatever, maybe the defender's numbers are sitting here, right? This 3,439 total, or this 851 per teammate. So maybe this is where the defender's numbers are. And so if you kind of think that way, then maybe that smidge of a difference in the rate between the two is actually a statistical tie. I don't know. Maybe. That is something to take a look at that you have to consider. Then we have the other graph I want to take a look at. Scoot that over here. We kind of plot this as a percentage of. Now this is interesting. So if our normal team size is 5 players and everybody's doing equal share regardless of AT, I know, yeah, certain ATs are doing more or less, you would expect a 1/5 share, or 20% of the kills, to be distributed for each player. And so if you're getting more than that, you're contributing more of the share. If you're doing less, you're contributing less of that. So if you were to ask people before you look at these numbers, hey, defenders, high damage, low damage, you probably, oh, they're low damage. Are they going to get the share of the defeats that the blasters and the scrappers, everybody else? No, they'll get less. So you would probably on paper assume that defenders would have lower than 20%. But when you look at the numbers that my data's produced, I've actually beaten that slightly, 22.5%. Now these are my defenders, my build, my playstyles that carry across all defenders. No, obviously you'd have to test your own, but in my scenario, my defenders were contributing, about what they should have, a little bit higher. Their allies were 77.5%, a little bit less than what you'd expect. Now here's what's interesting. Controllers, hey, if they're about the same output, their defeats were 31.2. That's about 10% more than you would have expected. And then the teammates were 68.8. So there's a couple ways you can look at this. Man, the controllers are sure kicking ass, and they're doing an extra 10%. That's 50% more than they should have done, right? Because you're only expecting 20, they did 30, so they're putting in an extra 50%. Or you could look at it, well, boy, their teammates sucked or they were weaker. Possible, right? Possible. Um, there's different ways you can look at it. The controllers were doing something that allowed them to get more of the kills, or their teammates were doing something less to get less of the kills, at least compared to the defender numbers. So it's an interesting statistic, an interesting peek at another way of looking at these numbers. Let me zoom out again so we can get into the interpretation of this data. All right, so interpreting this lethality load. Teammate kills, nearly identical numbers between the two archetypes. Both of them are leading a team in similar kill numbers. Kills per teammate, again, is very close. That suggests that teammates across both sides, all the different missions, were contributing evenly, kill wise. And again, this kind of helps me to make that argument that even though the teams were different and we weren't running all the same thing every single time, I was producing roughly the same numbers, whether it was defender controller across the board. Now, again, we would probably have to really dive into this statistic on a per character, per mission basis to really see if there's any sort of correlation in that statement. But just in the bulk, there was no huge difference between defender and controller teams. So it helps me with that argument. If I conglomerate all the data together, then I can smooth out any of the lumps that outliers can produce. Controller lethality is concentrated, though, even though their teammates didn't lag far behind the defenders' numbers. So defenders, 22.5% of the total kills. Controllers were 31.2%. So a lot of the damage, or not necessarily the damage, a lot of the kills, a lot of the finishing blows were concentrated on the controller. So, hey, what can we hypothesize? What's going on here? Well, your controllers may have had more tools or pets tagging the final blows. All right, that's what this is again measuring. We're measuring final blows. Maybe the pets, because they're out there bashing on things too, that's allowing them to get that extra killing. Because remember, when we're looking at these guys side by side, defenders controllers, they have the same number of clicks of powers, and defenders technically have more attacks, but you can only click something to attack, so they're roughly the attack rate of each of these is the same. But if you have a set of pets out there that's also attacking at their rate, that can help you land more final blows. And possibly the controls having, because I did proc some of the controls with some damage, that could be another source of kill shots, or the containment double damage spike that you might get. That could also explain this. Or, like I said, the other option is their teammates were just maybe more in a supporting role, maybe more taunting, tanky types, playing less aggressive, perhaps, hanging back. I don't know, letting the controllers get out there and do their thing. Maybe. Have to go back and look at each video and try to gauge that. I'm not sure that's even possible. Your defender lethality is distributed as the teams had higher kills per teammate than the controllers. More ally throughput. The teammates dealt the finishing blows more often, so the team was throwing out that finishing blow. Defenders might not be logging the kills. This is the big thing that I'm wondering. And maybe they're not logging the kills, but they're boosting the teammates' ability to land the kills. That would fit with what their archetype is supposed to be able to do. Is this because of the defender? Maybe. Could be. Maybe that extra 10% or whatever they get on their buffs explains this. What I really wish I had was all the stats from the other players on all the teams. Now, that would be murderous amounts of data, but it'd be nice to be able to take a sneak peek at a few of them just to see if this is a potentiality or not. Now, that would be a cool study. But defenders amplifying the team's total lethality, even though they don't personally get credit on the scoreboard. That's kind of my leading hypothesis here, because I felt my defenders were doing their job. and they were doing damage, but they weren't necessarily getting the kills. All right, let's move on to our next stat, threat. Not threaty, but threat. This is one of the other big stats. This is sort of that bulk amount of damage that your character's putting out here. So if we put all the data together, whoops, sorry, that was that. Hold on one second. There we go. I had to fix the table for a second. All right, so threat. Our fourth big stat here. This is the damage output. So this one, I think, is going to show us some very interesting comparisons here. This is like one of those major um, statistical categories that I've collected, because the other ones, the defeats, the killing blows, that tells you a little bit about offense, but not much. But just the raw damage output is what threat's going to show us. So we took all of our different characters again, added everything up, did our rates, did our composites. So here's what we got. This one again is going to be very similar to that the foe defeat numbers here. We've got 1 million and 09. So we say 1.09 million damage over here. This was 1.48 million. So pretty hefty, 0.4 million, about 400K more on the controller side. Is that statistically significant? But don't know. It's not as dramatic as you think, because we're dividing. Actually, it is. It's actually, I'm sorry, it's more dramatic, I think. Actually, no. Yeah, because this was shorter. Remember, shorter time, you'd expect less damage. Longer time, you'd expect more damage. That kind of, just makes sense. So it's the rates we really want to focus on. So when we focus on the rates, it kind of comes back down to earth, this difference. We got 3164 per minute damage versus 3783 per minute. Hey, is that statistically significant? We want to figure that out. The composites, this looks a little bit sketchier. 791 versus 1029. There seems to be a definite advantage here. A couple hundred per minute per teammate. So maybe the controllers are having to do more per teammate. So those are our numbers. Now we want to look at the statistics on these and see if they mean anything. So again, I don't think I need to zoom in on this one for you guys to see it clearly. The threat rate, if we go ahead and look for overlap, there isn't. Again, there's not any overlap here. The controllers, cha-ching, are doing not just more kills per minute, more defeats per minute. They are out damaging the defender per minute, so they get another +1 point. They are out damaging them. If we look at the composites, we look at the data spread, they're both very tight. There's only one outlying mission. I don't know if that's enough to explain this. Just one mission? Probably not. But overall, they are able to push the damage output higher than the defenders. The defenders are, more clustered down here. There are a few upper quartile defenders out there, like my time manipulation defender, Marquis, was pretty good at doing damage output. But the controllers are definitely able to push it. And then threat correlation. Both of the archetypes do correlate. So the longer the missions are going, the more damage they're doing. So they're not getting tired. They're not, spiking early in a mission and then just not doing much, right? They're pretty consistent, going, putting damage out, and there's pretty tight core, very little difference between the two of them, 9.5 and 9.3. All right, so the interpretation of this is pretty straightforward. Your controllers do significantly more damage per minute on average than your defenders. 3783 versus 3164. Both archetypes have correlation between their damage and mission time. Longer missions, more time to have an impact. Controllers had a little bit more volatility, a little bit greater spread in their data, wider range of values, and the higher outlier pushes their composite further than the defenders, who are more consistent and no outlying data. So that's what that shows us. But again, we're gonna dive into this because And why is this the case? Like, what's going on? Controllers don't have a lot of attacks, right? They've got controls. And your controls, yeah, you can slot them for damage, but you don't have a ton of them. Defenders have like whole set of attacks, a whole bunch of range things. Controllers have a control set, and maybe half the powers actually do some damage. I did put some damage procs in a lot of my controllers' powers, and I did overall build them to be more damagey than controlling. But still, my defenders are not like they didn't have attacks or debuffs. But I think here's where the story is. Pets. I talked about it a bunch in those DEFCON videos, the later ones especially. The contribution of the pets was just outrageous. And not just for controllers, but for the defenders as well. Let me go ahead and zoom in on this graph for you. All right, here it is. So these bar graphs are representing the total damage outputs of the two characters or the two archetypes. Defenders, like we said, 1.09 million damage output. Controllers, 1.48. But then when you look at the sources of the damage, the character versus pets, if you look at the defender characters versus the controller characters, they are equal. They're doing the same amount of damage. Right? I mean, that is what it is. With containment, with all the extra attacks, they're doing the same amount of damage. Slightly higher on the defender side. But where the difference is, and it's clear as day, you got this amount of damage for the defenders is coming from pets, and that amount of damage plus at least like 1.5 times or something like that, right? That much damage is coming from pets. Okay, that is not equal. The controllers are out damaging, and I bet you this is why they have more kills, because of pets. End of story. This is why they have more damage. They're pets. What I would like to actually test is a mind controller who has no pets. I wonder if I had a mind controller, they would probably be even Stevens with the defenders all the way, if not less, depending on what defender I matched them up with. But I'm betting because those pets were doing outrageous amounts of damage. It's crazy. This graph over here shows you the distribution of that pet contribution. So, hey, was it just a couple of flukes that were explaining why there's so much damage? No, not really. I mean, here it is. You can see here's all the different pet damage contributions here versus the defender. And the controller's distribution is just clearly higher, right? They are doing more damage than the defender pets. And it's not just some, one or two little outlying data. It's pretty tightly clustered. And they are doing on average, they're sitting here around 50% of the damage. Okay, so if you look at just the contribution, this isn't their total damage. This is percent of the total damage. So this percent, it's roughly 50-50. The defenders, on the other hand, are only getting about 25% of their damage. So it's a 2-to-1. Okay, the controller pets are out damaging them. And I think it's just simple math because a defender, they can get an epic pet from, let's say, Mace Mastery or one of the Villain Mastery sets. Ice Mastery has a pet as well. Oh, and they can get it from their lore. So the average defender could get 1 here and potentially 2 here. There are pets in Electric Blast, so as a primary, you could get a pet, but only one that has it as electric. And secondary, you could get a pet, or sorry, secondary Electric Blast as a pet. Primary, the one would be Dark Miasma. But those are just edge cases, and not every defender is getting a villain epic pet, patron pet. And not everybody's got lore pets, or they don't have the 2 lore damaging pets. Controllers, though, their control set has pets. And you can have between 1 and, if you throw in the illusion controller, they can have up to 4 pets. They're Phantasm and the 3 Phantasm army. Possibly 5 if the Phantasm summons its decoy. Again, that's sort of edge case, but you can have 1, you can have 2 electrical pets, you can have 3 dark pets, you can have 3 fire pets, so you can get pets. They're all over the place. They have them except for mind control. And then, if they were to take secondary of dark, they could have another pet there. Most of their secondaries don't have it, but they could. They could get 1 if they want dark. And then epic, they also can get the epic patron pets. And they also can get a couple of lore pets. So the controllers can just get more pets. And the big difference is that these pets are on timers. These pets and their primary are not. When you summon your pet for your primary, it stays out until it gets killed, or you unsummon it or dismiss it. So I think this is the source of this difference. That dude right there. Because once you have it out, it's out and you don't need to worry about it. It's going to go smack some people in the face. It's going to give you consistent, constant damage. That's why when I ran my triple E Emperor Avenger Voltaic Sentinel, I was surprised by how much damage that Voltaic Sentinel did, because I wasn't paying attention to it. It was part of my secondary and it was just zapping things, but it did a whole bunch of damage. That is as equivalent as the defender can kind of get to what the controllers were doing, at least the ones that I tested. And that's why I hypothesized during some of my later tests that I bet you a very high damaging build out there for defenders would be Dark Miasma for the fluffy pet, with Electric Blast for Voltaic Sentinel, then whatever, patron pool or whatever you want for Ice Mastery to take your epic, and then go get the 2 damaging lore pets. And I bet you that defender would start to show damage levels like these controllers are doing, roughly the 50-50 thing. It wouldn't be quite 50-50 because these pets do dismiss themselves and you have to keep resummoning them, but it would be pretty darn close, I think. And I also think that might be why my traps defender was pretty damagey too, because she had kind of pseudo pets with her traps and stuff. But I think if you look at the data carefully, that's what we're seeing here with the controllers. They're out damaging because their damn pets are so powerful. My question, and maybe people don't want to hear this, is that what they're supposed to? Is that working as intended? Should controller pets be doing that much damage? I don't know. I mean, they do. I don't know if that's what they're supposed to do, though. Or if anybody's even asked that question. I don't know. But here you go. There you go. First time asking it. All right. And it's not out of jealousy. I'm just saying, dang, they do a lot of damn damage. Is that what they're supposed to do? All right. So anyway, interpretation. Controllers unleashed more overall damage, driven heavily by high-performing pets that are close to 50% of their damage. That's the thing I do want to throw out there, is because I'm leaning towards they are doing too much damage. Because here's my point. What other power set in the game, primary, secondary? Okay, so you got your primary set, you got your secondary set, and there are 9 powers you can pick from as you go down the list. What other power set, a single power in that power set? So if I take this one power out, they're not even like level 32 anymore. But let's just pretend it's my tier 9 control power for my controller is giving you half of your damage. Do blaster nukes produce half the damage for a blaster? Do tier 9 attacks for brutes or scrappers do 50% of their damage? I don't think they do. I don't think they do. Meanwhile, though, I'm showing you that, well, I'm not showing, the data is telling me that controller pets a single power out of their potential 18 or whatever powers they're picking is doing half of their damage. That's crazy. Crazy. Now, yeah, some of that damage is set up by the buffs and the debuffs of their secondary, but woo, that's a lot of damage. Meanwhile, defenders are relying upon their blasting for their power, and they're blasting those 9 potential powers. Here's the other way to look at it. Of defenders' 9 potential blast powers versus the controller's 8 potential control powers are giving you roughly the same output. But that one controller power is freaking doing about this chunky amount, about this 25% here, with the rest being like lore and epic pets and stuff. That's what I'm wondering. Is that right? Is it supposed to do that? I know. Hey, sorry out there, controllers. I'm not calling for a nerf. I'm just like, something doesn't seem right to me. But you're getting about 28%. And remember, I was forcing this on my defenders. A lot of my defenders, I don't bother with pets. I will now moving forward, but most of the time, my defenders were kind of more thematic. I wasn't worried about having a pet. But if I'm worried about damage output as a defender, then I want a pet because they put out. And so statistically, you can see that, right? Defender's pet damage, 770k out of the 109. Controller 770 out of the 148. Anyway. So what I think we're seeing here is that controllers are force multiplying. They're leveraging their summoned pets and they're maintaining consistent pressure damage across all the missions from that source, even when the controller's not doing much of anything else. Your defenders, they're more this do-it-yourself ethos. They're channeling the bulk of their value through their own powers, not like pets, not a proxy. Pet protection. The other question I asked is the flip question of this. Are the pets contributing mitigation? This one was a little bit harder to put your finger on. Does higher pet damage correlate with fewer ally deaths? So this was the question. Again, this isn't the best way to look at it, but I didn't have like the true data I needed. But that's the basic question. Does having these pets, which we know leads to lots of damage, which is offensive, but does that also translate into protection? Because they're defeating things, because they're smashing things, is it mitigating incoming damage? Is it protecting the team? And that's what I was trying to see. So I did a little correlation here. So personal defeats, damage output, and maybe I need to look at this as it's a different study. But anyway, it's kind of thinking out loud in my brain right here. But so the slope of this damage. All right, sorry, it's caught an error there. I fixed it. So graph had the wrong label on the x-axis. That's ally defeats. So anyways, I was saying we're looking at, pets damage. Does it have anything to do with the protection of the team? And so ran the correlations on that. You can see there's no correlation with either of the controller in orange or the defender in blue, although the defender's a lot closer, 0.67 versus 0.26. And if you look at the damage per ally defeated, that's what the slopes are. So on average, the pet's damage output 5,700 per ally defeat versus 5,500 per ally defeat for the controller. So no correlation there. Pets, in other words, from what I'm able to tell here, are not reliably taking any hits for the teammates. Not reliably or distracting from what we can see with this data in order to reduce casualties and anything that you can predict. And the similar slope between the two is showing you that there's equal level investments in the pet generated threat, but lack of the correlation probably is suggesting the protection is situational. So there might be some spikes during certain fights, but it's not reliable. So the pets are roughly doing the same per ally, at least incoming, defeat stuff. So exactly, what we can interpret there, it just seems they don't have much to do with um, how many allies are being dropped. Because you would assume if the controller pets were doing more damage and that was somehow protective, then they should have had, a higher rate here. We don't see it. And then similar question is on the aggression side. Does pet damage correlate directly into more kills? Now this is an interesting comparison because for controllers the answer to that question is yes. So as the pet damage, and this kind of should make sense, right? Like, well, as the pets are doing more damage, they should be defeating more enemies. At least your total defeats, right? Because I don't think I forget exactly the log here on foe defeats. I don't know if it logs who the pets are killing. Pet kills. I know I gotta double check that, but something tells me that it doesn't. I think it might just, yeah, I don't recall there being a stat that. Let me double check that before I say anything more. Yeah, just double check the chat logs. They don't log who the pets kill. They just log the pets taking damage or the pets dealing damage. But they don't tell you, at least that I've seen, who the pet's killing. So that's an interesting kind of dilemma here. So anyway, what this has shown us here is that these are my controller or defender's defeating of foes versus the output. So is pet damage directly or indirectly leading to more kills by the character? We look at the correlations and the slopes, right? The defender slope, for every foe defeated, his pets or her pets were dealing 329. For the controllers, it was 475, and there was correlations. So the controller pets are directly leading, at least by correlation, between how much damage they're doing and how many defeats the controller's getting. So they're contributing reliable, damage, finishing power. There's a direct link there. The defenders are contributing damage, but it's more spread out, more diffuse. Maybe they're soaked into the AoE fights where others are landing the kills. Because the defenders are kind of mixing more personal damage into the equation. I don't know. Again, maybe you could try to figure it out on a case by case basis, but it is interesting that the controller pets are doing more damage, getting, associated with more contribution of everything. And here, their aggressiveness is leading to more defeats. And again, that should be kind of common sense, but maybe the bigger interesting thing is that the defender's not, because the defender pets are not up as often. So again, this is showing you the pet's contribution is very meaningful to a controller. Possibly too meaningful is my concern now. All right, another new statistic we can look at. I think I did talk about this in one of my last DEFCONs. It's something known as threat quotient. And this is the ratio between the damage output and the number of foe defeats. So this is asking that question, how much damage does it take for this support archetype to get a kill? Lower threat quotient means more of a character's damage is going into the kills directly. The player is likely landing a finishing blow, or they're dealing high impact, decisive bursts of damage. Higher threat quotients, the character's damage is spread across enemies. You're weakening them, but you're not landing the finishing blow. They're playing more enabling through support, is what we're thinking here. So, does damage output correlate to the number of foes being defeated? And the answer for both of these is yes. There is correlation. And the slopes, the threat quotients are here. The defender is doing 1088 per foe. The controller is 1003. No statistical difference between those two. And it's positively correlated, which means, yeah, of course, more damage. So not much we can say about whether or not there's better support or more damaging finishing blows being contributed here. But it's another metric we can kind of ask and take a look at. All right, on to the final major comparison. This is the biggest, most important stat as far as the defensive side goes, because we knew how many allies and are being defeated, how many times we're being defeated, but how much damage are we taking? Are we mitigating it at all between the archetypes? And this is where I really, really would like to have the data for some of those teammates, as to see if there's a statistical difference there, especially if it might be the same teammate that you play with on multiple um, missions. Now that would be one way to redo the study with like a control group put in there. If you have one player who agrees to show up with the same character, level locked, and no changes for the entire time. I don't know which crazy fool that would be. I'm sure there's a couple on Best of the Worst that would volunteer, but that would be asking a lot of somebody. But anyway, here's what we've got for this data set, because this is the one that I think is going to make or break this study at this point, because our controllers right now have the edge, right? They have the offensive number of foes they're defeating. It was close, but they have edged it out. And then we have a much more decisive difference in damage output, although we can attribute most of that to the pets, not to the controllers themselves. So that's kind of a, you know, depends on how you want to interpret that. Does that mean they're better supporters or not? I don't know. But here's our last stat. I mean, who is preventing damage? Who is mitigating? We got 156.7 versus 152.9. And remember, these numbers are pretty damn impressive, because if you go back, remember, I was doing millions it was like what, 1.09 million, I think, output. So that's huge differences here, right? And I forget what it was here, like 1.46, I think, million versus 0.15 million. So huge, huge ratio swings here. All right, but what we really want to focus on is this: 481 per minute, 373 per minute. That looks like a sizable difference. About 110 less damage per minute. Now, is that going to 110 less kill you per minute damage? No, because we saw that in the earlier stats that the defeats were not, statistically significant. So is this statistically significant? And does it necessarily mean that the support is better, stronger if you are taking less or more damage? You might argue, hey, because the defender's taking more damage, that means they're doing their job. They're sticking their face in there, type of thing. They're being the shield. They're absorbing more hits, where the controller's more, standing back out of the way and letting pets do stuff. I don't know. Again, that's the question to ask. Hypothesis to test. Let's take a look at the numbers, though, and I think you'll see the story here. And let's go ahead and zoom in on this so that you can see what I'm seeing. It's like zoom, zoom, zoom on this data. There we go. And why don't we format these grid lines? Give me 1 second. All right, I tweaked the colors and the thickness of the lines a little bit so you can see them better. So here you go. This is it right here. Here's our defenders, lower end of their significance, just above this line. And here's our controller, just below that line. That line being right here. What's that, 420? 420. 20, 40, 60, 80. Yeah. Hey, 420. So defender's lowest extreme is just above that 420 per minute. Let's call it 422. I don't know. And the controller is just below that 420 line. Let's call it 418. The controller is statistically significant less damage, better mitigation. I don't know how you want to word that. They're taking less per minute. The stats are showing you that. Edge controller, +1. I know some of you guys don't want to hear that, but it's facts. At least for the tests that I've done. It's true. It's not huge. Not huge at all. Perhaps even meaninglessly not huge, but it is statistically significant. And perhaps if you were to amplify this out over thousands of missions, then yeah, it might make a difference. But in the grand scheme of, hey, I ran 25 missions, does that matter? I don't know. It's your 25 missions. You tell me. But it's there. It is there. Let's look at the composite, see if there's any explanation for this. Anything that can maybe soothe this pain that some of you may be feeling right now. I don't see it. I don't see it. If anything, you could argue that, hey, the controllers have some upper skewing that is lifting their data into bad territory. And you can see that, on the average, it's pretty close right here. The data is pretty tight for the controller for sure. Defender's a little bit more spread out, a little bit more distributed, a little bit more variation in here. But boom, the controller, I mean, they have some upper stuff. So a couple of the controllers, or at least a couple of the missions, can skew high. They can take a good chunk of damage. So maybe less reliable. Maybe that's that whole hit or miss control concept. Possibly. Let's go look at the last stat here, correlation. Correlation. Is there correlation between the time of the mission and how much damage you take? The answer is no. It's close for the controllers. The longer their missions go, the more damage they're taking. It's close, but it's not statistically there yet. Let's see if we can figure out what the hell's going on here. Because when I did these individually, each individual DEFCON, there were definitive measures that the controllers were taking slightly more damage. And when we looked at the individual DEFCONs, we had kind of concluded we were just about tied with 2 wins each in a draw. But here in the summative concluding data, we are seeing the controllers pulling ahead here. The controllers took less damage per minute than the defenders by a statistically significant amount. Not huge, though. There was some standard error that was causing some wide variation in the defenders. So there was, a couple times that they were taking a bunch, and a couple times they weren't taking any. No correlation between incoming damage and mission time. That tells us the trend wasn't due to longer fights. Damage was just coming in at a steady clip for both of them. The composite distribution slows more tightly packed curve for the controllers, but more than half the IQR overlaps, meaning the real difference is just in the edge cases, individual missions. Not some huge gap between these two. Let's look at the resilience quotient. When a support character takes damage, does it protect the team from defeat? So does this incoming damage mean anything to the allies? That's what we're trying to ask here. So we took the resilience quotient is the damage in divided by ally defeats. Higher numbers suggests the support that soaks damage before the teammate falls. Lower numbers suggesting that teammate defeats occurred when the support wasn't there, or that the damage taken didn't mean anything. It's possible. Let's look for correlation. We don't see any. Defender's close. So as the number of teammate defeats goes up, does the damage the defender or controller takes goes up? In other words, you're standing there taking all the bullets, but it's not enough. Maybe that's what it means. This is interesting that, it's only about 50-50, flip a coin. So what it says here is defenders took more damage on average per defeat, suggesting they're taking more punishment without the team crumbling. So doing their job, perhaps. Controllers, on the other hand, showed lower damage per defeat, Either they weren't being hit as often, or their teams fell regardless of whether the controller was being damaged or not. Don't know. Or maybe the pets soaking some of the damage. But there's no correlation. So across these dozens of missions, there was no consistent relationship between how much a support was hit and whether their allies lived or died. In other words, the damage of a support character took may not be a deciding factor in the team's safety at all. So go back to that statistically significant difference again. That was barely a statistically significant difference. And it might not even mean anything anyway because it wasn't saving people. So maybe it's not about who's taking the hits, it's about who stops the hits from happening in the first place. And that's where I think our other major discussion point can come up in a minute. Let's take a look at damage efficiency here. This is looking at the ratio between incoming damage and outgoing damage. So damage out versus damage in is what we're looking at. So your offense versus your defense. Because the controllers were statistically significantly doing more output damage and taking less input damage, you can see that that is carrying over in this ratio as you'd expect. There is some daylight here between the two of them. It's not gross. Again, it's very, very tight. If we look at the distributions, they're very similar shapes. There's no huge numbers of outliers explaining this. They both have an outlier. The controllers, again, are pushing the upper limits of this because they're just doing more damage on average. And I'm going to kind of put the asterisk already. It's not that the controller's doing more damage, it's their pets. That's why they're doing more damage. Maybe the pets are also translating into a little bit less incoming damage too. Possible. Efficiency correlation. There is no correlation between input and output. It's close, but not quite there. Average ratios 10-1 and 10.1 versus 14.2. In other words, defenders are putting out 10 points of damage for every one they take. Controllers are putting out 14 for every one they take. If we were to look at that again, though, remember that half of this is pets. So 7 and 7. And about a quarter of this. So 7 and 3. And again, the defenders and controllers are doing about the same, but it's the pets that are spiking things. Controllers are more efficient at trading hits for harm. They're getting more bang for each point of damage they endure. The gap is marginal, though. Defenders are keeping pace in many of the missions, outperforming in some of the missions. The distributions overlap mostly. Controllers skewing a little bit at the top end. The controllers are edging ahead and overall, not a rout, but strategically a win, showing, I don't even want to say overwhelming power, but they're showing some superiority. So final verdict. What does it all mean? I think you kind of know part of the answer here. So, after 51 missions, over 4,000 total kills, dozens of metrics across 5 power set matchups, our controller archetype is edging out our defender in overall performance, not dominance. So the call is going to be this. Victory controller, but with an asterisk. Let's try to dissect this. Let's try to figure out what's going on. The pets are definitely a major player here. So, hey, why did the controllers come out on top ultimately? They had higher damage output, so they had the statistically significant advantage in damage per minute. It wasn't huge, but it was there. And it held across most of the matchups and showed correlation with mission time, showing you it's a scalable impact. Superior lethality. Your controllers average 3.6 kills per minute versus the defender's 3. Statistically significant. They also claimed 31.2% of the total team kills on their 5-player teams, which tells you they're punching well above their weight in offensive contribution. Who would have thought that? That they're doing almost a third of the team's kills. Better damage efficiency. They took less per minute and dealt more, so they had the higher out to in ratio. It wasn't overwhelming again, but it was clean and it was consistent. They had a higher threat quotient. Both the archetypes showed correlation between their damage and their kills, but controllers converted their damage to kills more efficiently, and often through this pet synergy and stacking AoE sources of damage, controls, debuffs, and pets. They're able to lump it all together and have the dog pile on top. But caveats where the defenders fought back. They had stronger individual set performances in a couple instances. Time manipulation, traps matchups. Defenders won those clearly, I thought, showing if you have a smart, aggressive build, you can absolutely rival or exceed a controller, even with all their pets. And the wins weren't marginal either, especially with Marquis. They came with superior personal performance and better team outcome. The defenders had stronger reliability in their support role. Defenders consistently had lower standard deviations in a lot of the key metrics. This suggests that greater stability and less reliance on team composition or pet AI. And their resilience quotient was higher, meaning they absorbed more punishment before their allies went down, suggesting they are sticking their face in there. I don't think this was a test of power sets. I think it's more of a test of purpose. The defenders held the line. They soaked hits. They were steering danger. They were stabilizing chaos. And when they shined in these missions, it was because they took risks that other people weren't, that other people standing back looking. Now, a few times they paid in blood, but I think that's a defender's job because it buys the team time to win. Controllers, for the most part, what I was noticing is that they were seizing the field and they were setting the tempo, squeezing the enemies together, letting the pets get in there and handle whatever was left. And whenever they would kind of surge with damage or whatever, it wasn't all flashy. It was these layers of control and buff and debuff and pets. And it just would apply pressure nonstop and just grind everything into dust. Raw numbers, controllers did edge ahead. This is true. More kills, less damage, more threat per second, per minute, whatever. But it's not that they're stronger, it's that they were built to scale up. And that's what they do if you're bold with them. So the defenders weren't outclassed by a controller, they were just outstacked. The controller is able to stack their damaging controls with their debuffs, with their buffs, and their pets. And it was this multi-layer stacking that ultimately paid off for them. The defenders were more binary. They didn't have those extra layers without all the pets to be able to run around and deal extra damage. So the final takeaway, wrapping this up, I think the controllers are thriving in synergy. Overlapping controls, pets, AoEs gives you the scaling momentum. I think they're built, or when you build them, is look for this compounding pressure concept, and you'll be able to just rise up to the top with your controller. Defenders, I think, thrive in tension. If you embrace the risk, you tank team pressure when needed, you protect spaces for others to be successful. Build yourself for edge play and you'll shine. So at the end, I don't think the archetype defines the success of any of these characters. I think it's the powers you're picking it's your team awareness, like what you can do, what the team can do, what the enemies can do. Then what's your play style? That is going to be the big difference maker here. And there you have it, ladies and gents. That's DEFCON 5. That's the end. That's the end of this monumental series. It wasn't a big duel, it was a deep dive. There wasn't some grand gavel slamming verdict here. I think this was more of a lens looking at what you can do. So I think whatever you end up picking for yourself or whatever you decide, I think you should build something that brings fire. And don't just support. I'm a healer. Dominate. Get aggressive. Go after it. Well, there you go. That is my take on defenders versus controllers. Hopefully, you guys got a lot out of this. It was a fun time for me. Kind of mixed emotions at the end here. It's kind of sad that things are over, but also kind of glad because damn, I am tired of looking at these freaking numbers. I'll tell you that. But hopefully, you guys did get some stuff out of this, gave you some thoughts, some ideas. So, in the meantime, have yourselves a good one and peace out.